You are a human animal. You are a very special breed. For you are the only animal who can think, who can reason, who can read.
Hi, this is Michael Silverblatt, and welcome to Bookworm. Today my guest is David Foster Wallace, the author of Infinite Jest, recently published by Little Brown. He's the author as well of a book of stories, Girl with Curious Hair, recently put out in paperback, and an earlier book, soon to be out or available again, called The Broom of the System. I don't know how exactly to talk about this book, so I'm going to be reliant upon you to kind of guide me. But something came into my head that may be entirely imaginary, which seemed to be that the book was written in fractals.
Expand on that.
It occurred to me that the way in which the material is presented allows for a subject to be announced in a small form. Then there seems to be a fan of subject matter, other subjects, and then it comes back in a second form containing the other subjects in small, and then comes back again as if what were being described were, and I don't know this kind of science, but it just, I said to myself, this must be fractals.
I've heard you were an acute reader. That's one of the things structurally that's going on. It's actually structured like something called a Sierpinski gasket, which is a very primitive kind of pyramidical fractal. Although what was structured as a Sierpinski gasket was the first. Was the draft that I delivered to Michael in '94, and it went through some, I think, mercy cuts. So it's probably kind of a lopsided Sierpinski gasket now. But it's interesting. That's one of the structural ways that it's supposed to kind of come together.
Michael is Michael Peach, the editor at Little Brown. What is a Sierpinski gasket? It
would be almost. I would almost have to show you. It's kind of a design that a man named Sierpinski, I believe, developed. It was quite a bit before the introduction of fractals and before any of the kind of technologies that fractals are a really useful metaphor for. But it looks basically like a pyramid on acid with certain interconnections between parts of them that are visually kind of astonishing, and then the mathematical explanations of them are interesting.
All I really know about fractals comes from an essay by Hugh Kenner, who leapt up and said, "Oh, Pound did this." And he was trying to suggest that the ways in which material is organized in poetry and elsewhere is extremely unsophisticated, that the patterns of disorder are much more beautiful than the patterns of order, and equally discoverable. When you structure a book in this way, do you mean it to be discovered?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question, because I know that when I was a young writer, I would play endless sort of structural games that I think, in retrospect, were mostly for myself alone. I didn't much care. I don't really... I mean, Infinite Jest is trying to do a whole bunch of different things at once, and it doesn't make much difference to me whether somebody... I would expect that somebody who's a mathematician or a logician or an ACS guy might be interested in some of the fractal structures of it. For me, I mean, a lot of the motivation had to do with, it seems to me that so much of premillennial life in America consists of enormous amounts of what seem like discrete bits of information coming, and that the real kind of intellectual adventure is finding ways to relate them to each other and to find larger patterns and meanings, which of course is essentially narrative, but that structurally it's a bit different. And since fractals are a more kind of, oh Lord, since its chaos is more on the surface, sort of its bones or its beauty a little bit more, that it would be a more interesting way to structure the thing. Okay, now I'm meandering, but I know that I know that for doing something this long, a fair amount of the structural stuff is for me, because it's kind of like, pitons in the mountainside. I mean, it's ways for me to stay oriented and engaged and get through it. I don't think I would impose weird structures on the reader the way I would have, say, 10 years ago. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does,
Okay.
but I wanted to suggest, at least for me, that the organization of the material, whether or not someone leaps up and says fractal or even has heard of fractals, seemed to me to be necessary and beautiful because we're entering a world that needs to be made strange before it becomes familiar. And so it seemed to me that in this book, which contains both the banality and extraordinariness of various kinds of experience, and the banality of extraordinary experience as well, that
And the extraordinariness of banal experience.
yeah, that a way needed to be found, and it thrilled me that it seemed to be structural, that the book found a way to arrange itself so that one knew, for the longest time you would be faced with these analogies. When Ulysses came out, people talked about its musical structures. When Dos Passos' books came out, people talked about film editing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very hard in the last period of years to find a new way to structure a book. The only thing that I know is Barth working with logarithmic spirals to deal with the unfoldings of memory and of seeing things from a new perspective at later dates.
You got to realize, though, when you're talking to somebody who's actually written the thing, there's this weird Monday morning quarterbacking thing about it, because I know that, at least for me, I don't sit down to try to, let's see, how can I find a suitable, structural synecdoche for experience right now? It's more a matter of kind of whether it tastes true or not. And I know that this is the first thing I ever did that I took money for before it was done, because I just didn't have any money, and I wanted to finish it. And Michael Peach, the editor, said, I think he got like the first 400 pages, and he said it seemed to him like a piece of glass that had been dropped from a great height. And that was the first time that anybody had ever conceptualized what was, to me, just a certain structural representation of the way the world kind of operated on my nerve endings, which was as a bunch of discrete random bits, but which contained within them, not always all that latently, very interesting connections. And it wasn't clear whether the connections were my own imagination and were crazy, or whether they were real and what were important and what weren't. And so, a lot of the structure in there is kind of seat of the pants, what kind of felt true to me and what didn't. I did not sit down with, I'm going to do a fractal structure or something. I don't think I'm that kind of writer.
So there aren't diagrams, or the diagrams emerged as you went along?
Well, I've got a poster of a Sierpinski gasket that I've had since I was a little boy that I like just because it's pretty. But it's real weird. I think writing is a big blend of, there's a lot of sophistication and there's a lot of kind of idiocy about it. And so much of it is gut. And this feels true, this doesn't feel true, this tastes right, this doesn't. And it's only when you get about halfway through that I think you start to see any sort of structure emerging at all. Then, of course, the great nightmare is that you alone see the structure and it's going to be a mess for everyone else.
Well, what thrilled me about the book is that around 200 pages in, what I felt about it was that it just began to get better and better and better. I started to like it more and more and look forward to going back to reading it, and felt a kind of, tenderness toward it, toward both its character and its narrator, because of the extraordinary effort that was going into writing it. It didn't seem like difficulty for difficulty's sake. It seemed like immense difficulty being expended because something important about how difficult it has become to be human needed to be said, and that there weren't other ways to say that.
I feel like I want to ask you to adopt me. Because, this is the great nightmare when you're doing something long and hard is you're terrified that it will be perceived as gratuitously hard and difficult, that this is some, avant-garde for its own sake sort of exercise. And having done some of that stuff, I think, earlier in my career, I was really scared about it. That the trick of this, I've got this whole rant about I think a lot of avant-garde fiction and serious literary fiction that bitches and moans about readers' defection and blaming it all on TV is to a certain extent bullshit. That I think that I think a lot of the avant-garde has forgotten that part of its job is to seduce the reader into being willing to do the hard work. And so doing something like this, there were a lot of fears, and one of them was, oh no, this doesn't make any sense. Another was, oh no, this is going to come off as gratuitously long or gratuitously hard. And I don't know, it makes me happy you said that, because I worked harder on this than anything I've ever done in my life, and there's nothing in there by accident. And there have already been some readers and reviewers that see it as kind of a mess and as kind of random, and I just have to sort of shrug my shoulders.